Welcome back to the Stratcom podcast. I'm so happy to say that today we're joined by Roberta Duffield. Roberta is the Director of Intelligence at Blackbird AI, and she brings a wealth of different interdisciplinary experience, working in the military, post-conflict humanitarian development, journalism, risk intelligence, both in the UK and the Middle East and elsewhere. Roberta, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Great to be here.
I was hoping maybe you could first tell us a little bit about Blackbird AI, your company, and what do you do?
Yeah, sure. So Blackbird AI, we're a AI tech company situated in the US, and we focus on leveraging AI-driven solutions to addressing the problems around information warfare, influence operations, and disinformation. So anything that could be considered sort of a manipulation of the digital information environment and an attack on human perception. So we use AI to find novel ways that can help us identify, track, and then mitigate these influence operations that you see online.
And how do you do this? How does one, what are those kind of promising AI-based, AI-driven approaches to identify manipulated content?
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, we try to approach the problem and understanding the information environment with as wide lens as possible. So I think this is really, really key. You have to try to understand the landscape holistically in order to really get the full context of what might be going on when it comes to information warfare. So we are, in that sense, we are a narrative and risk intelligence company. We look at the narratives that we see being propagated online, and we use that as our first starting point to unpack those and understand the dynamics behind them. So we use a range of different signals and classifiers and AI tools to help us do that. We don't just kind of focus on or laser in on just one aspect of that. So, for example, we often get people coming to us and saying, okay, you look at disinformation, right? Or you look at things like deep fakes, these kind of buzzwords that people are very familiar with when we talk about information warfare. And I always try to sort of step that back a bit and say, okay, yeah, we do look at things like that, absolutely. But that's absolutely not the whole kind of part of the picture. And that's something that I really like to try to get across to people in order to help them understand information warfare and manipulation of perceptions in a more meaningful way. So, we look at things like actor intelligence. Who are the groups on social media, online, who might be spreading certain messaging, and who are the demographics of those people and their audiences who are receiving those messages, and what can that tell us about the intent and purpose and impact of different narratives. Then we also look at things like network intelligence. So what are the relationships between these different groups? And once you can understand a network, you can start to dive into the mechanisms of how these narratives are spread as well. So how do messages and conversations propagate through different communities? Do we see things like amplification from bots that might artificially amplify a story to make it more visible to people? Or do we see, not necessarily bot activity, but kind of AI signals that can help point us in the direction of there's something kind of untoward or suspicious going on here? It might not be bots, but there's certainly, patterns that are deemed to be kind of out of the ordinary when it comes to a certain subject that's being talked about. And that can point us in the direction of, okay, we're starting to see messaging around a certain topic coming out, and this doesn't look organic, it looks inorganic. So we look at a whole kind of range and host of these signals to understand that. And I think that's really where our strength lies. So sometimes those things that we look at might have elements of disinformation in, or they might have elements of deep fakes or AI kind of enabled tactics in there, but that's not the whole story. We want to zoom out a bit and look at the entire environment and all of the kind of adverse narratives that you might come across.
So you mentioned the term information warfare, which is a quite, I would say, like aggressive formulation. So just maybe you can clarify for our viewers, what do you mean by that? And information warfare by whom? What are the sort of cases and clients that you are working for? Are you working for governments? Are you working for private clients? And who are they trying to protect against?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first off, we work with a huge range of different clients across many different vectors and industries, both private sector, public sector, NGOs, national governments, security organizations, and so on. I believe our tech can be applied to, a wide range of different use cases. I guess information warfare, maybe perhaps more applicable in the kind of geopolitical, national security kind of sectors. It's perhaps better kind of more widely described, I suppose, as information manipulation and perception manipulation. I do quite like using those terms, particularly perception manipulation, specifically, as I think that really speaks to all of those different use cases across those different kind of client needs. It's the idea that the kind of content that we consume online and the kind of communities that we might be interacting with online have a very kind of powerful process of subject formation within them. They can shape people's ideas. They can shape people's the way people, or in the way in which people relate to the world and the way in which they respond to other people and events in the world. And that's really what we want to understand more. How do those processes happen? And in certain contexts that will take the form of information warfare. Specifically, we do work on things like the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel-Palestine, and so on. And certainly Russia-Ukraine war, this is a great example of where you see a lot of this kind of information warfare, the kind of influence operations that are pushed by a hostile state, with the deliberate intent to destabilize their opponent and spread divisive rhetoric. In other cases, if we might look at something like brand risk, corporate risk, something like that, it might be something that is, spread about a certain brand, company, its personnel, its products, whatever that is, to try to persuade or manipulate audiences in a certain way, either for financial gain or political means or for something else. But I think really what we're talking about is that broader spectrum of how people are influenced by what they see online and how that changes the way they relate to the world.
When it comes to information manipulation, perception manipulation, you brought up Russia's war against Ukraine. Do you see kind of specific maybe lessons or practices that have come out of that have also maybe altered your own understanding of these issues or your company's work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot to say here. I'll try to do it justice. It's certainly been a really interesting learning curve to be working on this kind of subject matter. There's a lot to be learnt there about the kind of, tactics, techniques and procedures that these kind of threat actors use. And what is really remarkable is that, once you gain that understanding of how these kind of adverse narratives are rolled out, you can begin to see these patterns and you see them repeat themselves over and over and over. And you might see that in the context of Russia-Ukraine. You might see the same threat actors associated with Russia rolling out other disinformation type narratives, maybe in a US context to destabilize elections, stuff like that. We recently did some really interesting research work on elections in the Sahel and Central Africa region. And what we were seeing there in multi-languages, French, English, and so on, these same threat actors using their same threat playbook, but in the kind of Central African context, aimed at destabilizing and dividing public opinion around different political opponents as standing for election in Chad. So it's really remarkable to see how once you kind of get into that world, the same things are repeated over and over and over. And of course, from our standpoint, understanding that better, better informs us and the clients that we work with to be able to guard against that.
when we talk about the kind of applications of AI in information manipulation by hostile states, so what are some of those kind of really nightmare scenarios that would prevent you from getting your beauty sleep at night? What are the scenarios that are really, really worth stressing about?
Yeah, so this is a really great question. It comes up a lot, unsurprisingly. And yeah, I would say first off that we are only just on the edge of this right now. I think, the worst is certainly yet to come. And a lot of that to do with just the rate and pace of innovation and development within, AI and other kind of, tech fields that could be leveraged to propagate information warfare. So, what we see right now is certainly not what we're going to see in a year's time or 5 years' time. These kind of threat landscapes are going to look completely different. So when we're specifically talking about AI and the threat from AI, I would say that right now we're probably more of in a situation where threat actors are testing out different scenarios and different tactics, but they're yet to be really deployed in a way that is making a huge, very wide, significant impact. However, I think that will change. So one example would be, I'm sure everyone or people are aware of, Russian interference in the US 2016 elections. They employed human labor to pose as, authentic US citizens and, disseminate this kind of divisive rhetoric about the elections to other, genuine American citizens. And, that's very persuasive. It's very realistic because it's humans doing this. So what I believe the kind of nightmare scenario is, and I think it's likely that we will start to see more of this in a more impactful way, is that kind of tactic will be repeated. It will just be kind of absolutely supercharged with the application of AI. So what we're really talking about is industrial scale deception and disinformation here. It's the ability of AI to scale up an operation like that, where you can have, almost infinite number of AI agents that are extremely realistic. They can talk and speak and interact with people iteratively in a way that is, human-like and persuasive. They can be tailored to a certain group or demographics, particular interests or beliefs. And, crucially, this can be repeated, over and over again without the need for having to employ specific actual real-world people to do this. So I think that is really the kind of frightening reality of where we might be headed. I think right now, these kind of technologies are still, wildly expensive to build and run at any kind of scale or large scale. But, that will change, obviously. So I think it's things like that keep me up at night more, because to me that's more insidious. That's harder for people to actually recognize that themselves. Whereas, there's a lot of scaremongering and fearmongering around something like deepfakes. I mean, well, on one hand, that's certainly justified. There's definitely a big threat there. But to me, the kind of deepfakes, they're often easier to debunk. They're easier to recognize. Think of something like a deepfake of President Zelensky or Joe Biden or something like that being published on the web,
saying to surrender, to give
saying
up,
to surrender, or or we're sending, Joe Biden's sending American troops to Ukraine, or things like inflammatory things like this. Like the second that's released on the web, you have internet sleuths debunking this, right? Poring over these kind of videos, and these kind of people, politicians with a major kind of public profile, they're ideally placed as well with their own press teams and PR teams and stuff to come out and say, hey, actually, that's not me. This is the official, president's office or whatever, and I'm saying that is not me in that video. So they can actually be kind of debunked quite quickly, in a sense. So that's why, I'm not saying...
But do you feel that's effective to come out and say, that's not me? Doesn't disinformation kind of notoriously spread much faster via different social media platforms than the kind of post-factum reactive attempt to fact-check it or to debunk it?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question, actually, because, having said all of what I said, I would always want to caveat it with something that kind of speaks to what you just said, which is I think this is the most kind of worrying thing about the nature of things like influence operations and disinformation to me, that what makes people vulnerable to this kind of messaging is usually their preconceived notions that they might hold, their kind of proclivities to think in a certain way, their pre-established fears, uncertainties about things. So disinformation that plays on that, it often feeds into a bit of a confirmation bias. So you definitely do see sometimes that, even if something is debunked, people will feel like, well, it might have been debunked, but I kind of feel like it should have been true, right? And so people can hold those two things in their head at the same time. They can know on an academic level that it wasn't true, but on like a subjective personal level, the feeling remains that like, well, I don't like that particular group of people, political party, whatever it is. So debunking doesn't necessarily change or shift someone's opinion in that way. And that's what I think is the most worrying thing. It's not always about fact checking. It's not always about debunking. It's about actually on a deeper, more meaningful level, changing the way people think about the world and relate to other people, which is obviously a much, much harder task.
So you mentioned how AI can and it already is used to kind of turbocharge the production of disinformation, the dissemination of disinformation. But what about the application of AI in kind of countering it, or in perhaps identifying a piece of disinformation before it goes viral, before it really infects the kind of wider information space? Could you tell us about any hope in this regard?
Yeah, for sure. Definitely have a couple of things to say here. I think, first off, I mean, that is what we are trying to do at Blackbird. We're trying to find new ways to leverage AI so we can, detect these kind of things before they go viral. However, I will say this is a super, super difficult task ahead of us. There's no kind of foolproof method of doing this. There's no silver bullet. What we can do, though, is look at kind of what we've learned through studying and working with data, where we see these threat actors, and kind of working on the kind of patterns of behavior that we see there and getting better at recognizing them. It's not always totally foolproof because threat actors are smart as well. Sometimes to push a disinformation campaign, for example, it might be the main effort to make it go viral as quickly as possible. Other times, we've also observed this, many times, it's actually the opposite. Threat actors don't want something to go viral as soon as possible because they want it to seed and kind of percolate in a more organic level before ramping it up. We've certainly, monitored a number of hostile narratives that look exactly like that. They're not necessarily pushed to go viral immediately. They are kind of woven in to kind of lay a groundwork for future use. I think we see that a lot actually with our work on Russia-Ukraine. We often see kind of Telegram or other kind of chat channels used as almost like incubators for narratives that then later kind of make it onto more mainstream platforms like Twitter or Reddit or so on. And I think it's all about just being able to recognize that and get smart about it. So, I guess the other piece to this, as well as, developing the tech ourselves that can help us recognize these things, I think it's also about collaboration and wider collaboration. So, it's not enough for a private company to develop these solutions and just keep them in-house. We want to foster greater collaboration between the private sector in these AI-led solutions and national governments and institutes and organizations. There should be a real push for more knowledge sharing, whether that's allowing governments and so forth to leverage those tech solutions themselves, or if it's, taking on the expertise from people who've, worked in the field and using that to inform things like future legislation or regulatory frameworks and stuff like that. Like, I think that's really what we need to be doing. It's not just about the tech itself. It's about how we share that, how we capitalize on it and exploit that.
Maybe just as a kind of final concluding topic, you brought up deepfakes several times. And this, of course, is the year of elections in the world, right? We have, of course, US, UK elections, elections all over the place, including in this country. We have European Parliament elections this year. And recently, the president of Latvia proposed a kind of a new law, a legal amendment that would criminalize, put criminal liability for the creation and spread of deepfakes online about political candidates or elected officials in the pre-election period. Do you think such approaches are realistic, completely illusory? Are they the way to go?
Yeah, I think this is a really difficult question for sure, and I'm glad it's not my final decision on this, but I'll do my best to answer. So I think first off, the threat from deepfakes and how they can destabilize people's perceptions, influence people is very real. Fairly recently, actually, in the UK, we had the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, the subject of an audio deepfake that kind of stirred up pure right-wing, racist, nationalist tension. So, these things do have a real-world impact. However, outright banning them, even if for limited periods of time, whilst I think there's there's a lot of arguments for that, there's also arguments against it. I suppose, first off, what I believe is a stronger and more permanent defense against this is actually just strengthening the media literacy of the population and the society, and the democratic institutions and media institutions that serve as mouthpieces for talking about the electoral process. So if you have integrity in those institutions and, a strong media literate population, I believe that just by default, the threat of these deepfakes is lessened somewhat, and that's a more permanent kind of solution than rather banning them. I think as well, there's certainly debates people can get into around how this reflects on the idea of free speech and encroachment on that. So it's not quite the same, but it certainly reminds me of, I've previously lived and worked in the Middle East, where you often saw laws against what can and can't be said around the government, and those laws being slander, like libel laws being overstepped and used to prosecute, political opponents and things like that. So, when you talk about banning deepfakes, it's also about, okay, are we saying that other legitimate forms of expression using deepfakes or not, such as satire and things like that, should they also be banned? Where do you draw the line? Now, of course, Latvia is, this tends to happen more so in authoritarian dictatorship states, which Latvia is not. So perhaps the risk is lessened there. But I do think that it's not quite as clear cut as just, this is the answer and this is going to help us. I think there's deeper and wider debates there to be had.
Well, so many unresolved dilemmas, questions, and concerns, but I think your conversation really was a great benefit for our listeners. Thank you so much, Roberta, for joining us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.